Welcome to the deep dive. We take your stack of sources and basically try and uncover the most important insights.
Exactly.
And today we're diving deep into the, well, incredibly complex history of Yemen using this fascinating set of sources you've shared with us.
That's right. And this is a huge mission, really. We're covering millennia here, starting with ancient civilizations that, control global trade,
Right.
all the way up to the current humanitarian crisis. We'll be looking at Yemen's unique culture, those persistent internal divisions, and the relentless impact of foreign intervention.
Because, as your sources really lay out, this southern Arabian nation is described as, quote, a brilliant cradle of ancestral culture. Yet it's also been called, historically, the poorest Oriental country known. That's a direct description from the sources reflecting a different era's view.
Right. It's dated language, but it's in there.
And today, it's facing what some people are calling the Forgotten War. So our goal is really to help you understand the deep historical roots behind these stark contrasts.
Okay, so let's unpack that ancient past first. Your sources are very clear. Yemen is the cradle of the oldest South Arabian civilizations.
We're talking big names here.
Yeah, powerful, prosperous states like Sabaean, you might know it as Sheba and Himyar, really significant players back then.
And here's where it gets really interesting for me. Their wealth wasn't just like local farming, was it? What did the sources say was the absolute cornerstone?
It was absolutely their control of transit trade, specifically the incense route. And this wasn't just a small track, it was a major international highway, basically, connecting India, East Africa, all the way to the Mediterranean.
Wow.
Places like Egypt, the Greco-Roman world, Syria, they were trading things like incense, obviously, but also myrrh, silk, metals, even European wool, apparently.
And the ports were key.
Absolutely vital. Ports like Aden and Musa, which later became Mocha, famous for coffee, there were crucial hubs for all this activity. Mareb City also flourished because of this trade.
So it really was about location, leveraging those global connections. But what about at home? Was it purely trade, or did they have another foundation for this wealth?
Oh, definitely. Agriculture was a key base, too. The sources mention things like Arabica coffee. Yemen's famous for that even now. But also rhubarb, henna, cereals, legumes, palm trees, fruit trees.
Like grapes, pomegranates?
Exactly. Dates, tobacco, wheat, barley, millet. A really diverse agricultural output.
And they weren't just traders and farmers. Your sources highlight some really remarkable engineering feats. What's the standout example from that time?
Oh, without a doubt, the Marib Dam.
Right.
It's described as just this remarkable accomplishment over 4 kilometers long, 15 meters high.
Huge for that era.
Incredible. And the technical skill involved, sources note it didn't overflow or breach for something like 30 years at one point. It irrigated this huge area supporting the population around Marib.
And you see that engineering skill in their architecture too, right? What kind of things were they building?
All sorts. Fortified temples, palaces, observatories, bridges, canals, extensive walls for flood protection. The sources mention these grand temples for their god Almaka, decorated with alabaster.
Oh.
And these unique tower-like houses. You still see that style in Yemen, sometimes 6, even 12 floors high. Really distinctive.
The sources also mention something that surprised me about this ancient period, a degree of religious tolerance.
Yes, that is quite fascinating, isn't it? They apparently introduced foreign gods like Zeus.
Really?
Yeah, and even built temples and churches specifically for foreigners. The source calls them aliens, but it means outsiders.
So you've got this picture of incredible wealth, advanced engineering, even a certain openness, but the sources say it all came crashing down quite dramatically. What happened?
Well, the key event seems to be the destruction of Mareb around 136 AD. It's linked to the dam collapsing or being destroyed, possibly by marauding stock breeders or tribes.
That made an impact.
Devastating. The sources call it the greatest economic collapse up to that point in history. It basically wiped out the agricultural heartland and fundamentally broke that major trade route. Yemen ceased to be a major trade hub after that.
And as Saba declined, did another power rise up to fill the gap?
Yes. The Himyarite kingdom rose to prominence then. They controlled the highlands and parts of what was left of the incense route.
But they had challenges.
They did. Controlling trade against other tribes was tough. And crucially, the sources mention the increasing use of the camel.
Ah, right. Game changer.
Big time. It made those traditional routes through settled areas vulnerable to intervention from the desert. It sort of shifted the whole balance of power and trade away from those established centers towards areas bordering the Nile, the Red Sea, the Persian Gulf.
So this decline really set the stage for the next massive transformation, didn't it? The arrival of Islam. What's the key takeaway for Yemen during this next roughly 1400-year period?
Well, it fundamentally reshaped the country. It transformed Yemen into an Islamic nation, deeply connected to the wider Arabian Peninsula. Islam spread after Muhammad's death in 632.
How did that happen? Peacefully.
Sometimes through, folkways and conversion, but often through pretty fierce battles. Many Yemenis initially took up arms against the expanding Muslim forces. Existing rulers, Persian and Christian, sometimes allied with the Umayyads against them.
And a really unique political structure emerged in this period, one that defined Yemen for over 1,000 years.
Exactly, the Zaydi Imamate. It lasted from about 870 right up to 1962.
Wow, that's a long time.
A very long time. It was centered mainly in the northern highlands, and its leaders claimed descent from the Prophet Muhammad. Now, there was often bloody competition for the position of imam,
Right.
but it definitely forged a specific political and religious identity for that part of Yemen.
And the sources mention their legal system, Zaydi fiqh, gave the imams a lot of power, but it also allowed for something quite radical.
Yes, this is interesting. Loyalty was often passed down through generations, tied to charters. But, and this is key, revolts against imams who were seen as despotic were actually considered lawful within their tradition.
So a built-in check on power, in a way.
Sort of, yeah. A dynamic of potential internal challenge was always there.
And how did this long Zaydi period affect Yemen's relationship with the outside world?
For the most part, it was a period of pretty deep isolationism. Your sources state that throughout most of the Yemen's existence, Yemen was, quote, virtually impervious to penetration by the modern world.
Except for the coast.
Exactly. Except for Aden and maybe a few Red Sea harbors. This kind of isolation was actually pretty typical for much of Arabia at the time, very inaccessible.
Digging into the sources a bit more, the spread of Islam seems to have had very specific, sometimes disruptive impacts, particularly on trade and the existing power structures.
Oh, definitely. Trade routes shifted, some ports like Mukalat suffered. The early Islamic expansion involved conquest, asserting new hegemonies like the rise of Bara or leaders. It also involved jihad against opponents at places like Mecca and Al-Hazramat. Pillaging was sometimes part of the reward system.
In the Zaydi branch itself, its origins are interesting. It emphasized merit, not just bloodline.
That's right. It was founded by Zayd ibn Ali, and initially there was this insistence on wider participation in selecting the imam based on learning and piety, not just direct descent.
So the idea was that leadership had to be earned.
Exactly. It reinforced the idea that the imam's authority wasn't absolute. If rulers were unsatisfactory, it could lead to fitna strife, and revolts were seen as lawful responses to despotism. This Zaydi movement gained ground, sometimes due to underestimation by opponents, like an Umayyad governor struggling with the terrain.
This history of internal dynamics, isolation, resistance, it brings us to a period where external powers really start taking control. What's the big picture of the Ottoman and British eras in Yemen?
Well, from roughly the mid-16th century up to the late 20th, foreign control becomes a really defining feature. It profoundly shaped different parts of the country, though, as we'll see, often not very effectively, especially in the interior.
Let's start with the Ottomans. They first show up in the 16th century.
Yes, after they defeated the Mamluks in Egypt, Yemen initially became a dependency attached to Egypt, but their first attempts at control in the early 1500s were pretty nominal and quickly challenged by rebellions.
They didn't get a firm grip.
Not really. They launched an aggressive attack in 1524, even besieged Sana'a, demanding suzerainty and wanting the Portuguese out. But by the 1530s, they had been pushed back from the interior, limited mostly to the coastline. They just couldn't maintain control without significant local collaboration, which they didn't always get.
And the Zaydi imams were key in pushing back.
Absolutely. Sana'a actually fell back under Zaydi rule in 1583, under Imam Mahdi Ahmad. The sources list reasons for rebellion like inappropriate taxes, corruption by Ottoman governors, land grant issues. Basically, bad administration fueled the resistance.
Did the Ottomans try again?
They did. There was a second Ottoman incursion in the early 17th century trying to establish more absolute rule. And then again later, there's what the sources call the Second Ottoman period, where they regained some control from the mid-19th century.
How is that second period different?
They often regained control through agreements with local clan leaders, like Rashid Pasha al-Hakim in Hadramaut, who then had substantial autonomy. Interestingly, under leaders like al-Hakim, we start to see some modern institutions appear trade with British Aden, a European-style school, even the first printing press, a connection sort of to the modernizing Egyptian state.
But resistance didn't stop. What made it so hard for the Ottomans to govern effectively, even then?
Well, the rugged landscape was always a huge factor. It just made military patrols and control incredibly difficult. And local leaders, the Didi imams, tribes, they consistently resisted central authority. The sources even mention yogurt makers pledging support to rebels.
Yogurt makers.
Yeah. It just highlights how deeply embedded local resistance was, right down to the everyday level. Ottoman control remained pretty tenuous, especially away from the coast.
So while the Ottomans are struggling in the north and parts of the interior, a new major player arrives in the south. The British. Why did they come, and what was their approach?
The British came primarily for strategic reasons. It started with occupying Aden in 1839.
Why Aden?
They needed coaling stations for their steamships going to India and Southeast Asia. And when the Suez Canal opened in 1869, Aden's importance just skyrocketed.
Okay, strategic location. And how did they rule compared to the Ottomans? Was it direct control?
It was actually a mix, and this is crucial for understanding later divisions. They had direct rule over Aden city itself, turning it into a modern port, part of British India initially. But for the vast hinterland, the rest of what became South Yemen, they used indirect rule. This became the Aden Protectorate, established from the 1870s onwards.
Indirect rule. What did that actually look like on the ground?
Essentially, the British kept local rulers, sheikhs, sultans in place. They gave them the authority to maintain order within their territories, in exchange for paying tribute and accepting British protection.
But the British called the shots, ultimately.
Exactly. And critically, the sources point out that these local rulers were largely excluded from the actual governance run by the British High Commissioner. Plus, the British often redrew administrative boundaries, ignoring traditional loyalties and structures.
What was the long-term impact of this British approach in the South?
The sources argue it was pretty negative overall. It tended to foster tribal and regional rivalries as rulers competed for British favor. Development outside Aden City was neglected. And it created these deep cleavages, tribal, local, national, that persist today. Even after a century, they never really established effective, unifying control over that hinterland. Their toolbox, as one source puts it, was simple and limited alliances. Indirect rule because direct administration was just too expensive.
So this whole history of divided control under different foreign powers, it really set the stage for what happened next, didn't it? The emergence of two completely distinct Yemeni states in the late 1960s.
Exactly. After the British left the south and the emirates was overthrown in the north, you end up with two Yemens. In the north, the Yemen Arab Republic, the YAR. It was born out of a civil war following the 1962 overthrow of the Zaidi Emirate, and it remained relatively underdeveloped, traditional, and isolated.
And the South.
That became the People's Democratic Republic of Yemen, the PDRY. This was the state largely constructed by the British. It was taken over in 1967 by the National Liberation Front after the British withdrawal, and initially it was ruled by pretty committed Marxists aligned with the Soviet bloc, pursuing a socialist path with Arab and Soviet aid.
So you have these two very different Yemens, literally side by side.
Precisely. One, the YAR, independent but underdeveloped, kind of cut off. The other, the PDRY, developing along socialist lines with external support. And they saw each other as rivals. The sources say their state media practically suggested invasion daily.
Now, in the north, the YAR, under Ali Abdullah Saleh from the late 1970s, the sources mention some significant changes happening then, partly funded by a big neighbor.
Yes, massive Saudi funding came in. You see new tractors, technology, buses, a big expansion of universities in the 1980s. So some modernization, a boost in education, funded partly by transit fees too.
But it wasn't all smooth sailing.
Not at all. This period also saw rising conflict, labor disputes, illegal trades, and increasingly deadly political infighting between different factions. Demagogic incitement turned deadly by the late 80s.
And meanwhile, in the South, the PDRY, initially aligned with the USSR, what happened there?
They received Soviet development and military aid. But then in 1986, there was this incredibly vicious internal power struggle. Many leaders were killed. A more moderate faction, under Ali Salim al-Bid, eventually gained prominence.
And they started looking towards the north.
Yes. Interestingly, they started making reconciliation overtures to the north. This happened just as the Soviet bloc was starting to collapse, which also meant the South's economic support system was crumbling, adding pressure for change.
Which brings us to a really key moment, unification in 1990. What was the hope behind bringing these two very different Yemens together?
Well, on paper, it made a lot of sense. Politically, the division was increasingly seen as artificial, especially by many in the South. Economically, there were hopes for, economies of scale. Potential oil wealth had been discovered in '84.
Right, the Almasila fields.
Exactly. Hopes for a unified power grid, administration, tourism. It was viewed by many as a historical culmination, a step towards rational regional development.
And the sources describe a lot of initial excitement, widespread celebration, nationalist pride.
Well, absolutely. Immense optimism initially. And it was followed by this brief, unprecedented period of pluralism and political opening.
Really? What did that look like?
An explosion of newspapers and media criticizing abuses, exposing corruption, televised debates. Dozens of new political parties formed. Military checkpoints disappeared in the main cities for a while. Journalists were astonished. There was this real moment where it felt like democracy might take root.
But the sources suggest this optimism.
Yeah.
Well, it didn't last long. It dissolved pretty quickly. What went wrong?
Yeah, the journey turned catastrophic relatively quickly. The unified republic faced just immense challenges almost immediately. There were huge, unexpected economic shocks.
Like what?
Well, after Yemen's stance during the 1990-91 Gulf War, siding with Iraq, there was a precipitous decline in aid from Gulf countries. Trade embargoes were imposed. Remittances from Yemenis working abroad were halted. They suddenly had this massive tower of debt.
So an economic disaster right out of the gate, fueling instability.
Exactly. Public services started to disappear. Conditions became shambolic in places. Bureaucratic corruption, which the new media was exposing, actually seemed to surge. And politically, the unified state was just incredibly fragile.
Fragile how?
Well, remember, President Saleh from the north, he had built his power base over decades by carefully balancing this coalition of tribal and military leaders, mostly from the north.
Right.
That coalition proved weak and deeply divisive in the context of the new unified Yemen.
And the sources point to something specific about Saleh's leadership contributing to this failure, a failure to unite people.
Yes, they really highlight his, ineptitude, frankly, in crafting a new national discourse, something that could genuinely replace the old, simple unity rhetoric and bring North and South together in a meaningful way.
And that failure left a vacuum.
It left the door wide open. All those underlying fault lines, regional differences, religious tensions between Zaidi North and Shafi South, class divisions, tribal loyalties, they were still there. And they were easily exploited by Saleh himself and by others competing for power.
And this fragility, these tensions, they eventually erupted into open conflict. The 1994 Civil War, what was that essentially about?
It was essentially the North, under Saleh, absorbing the South by force. Saleh announced it, demanding rebel surrender, and then launched attacks. From the Southern perspective, it felt like annexation. Their resources were taken, state assets and functions dismantled.
A brutal conflict.
Yes, very much so. Northern forces moved quickly, took Southern positions. The sources mention aerial bombardment causing significant casualties among Southern forces. The Southern leadership was apparently surprised by the ferocity.
And how was this war perceived differently in the North and South afterward? That must have left deep scars.
Huge scars. The sources note that Southerners often refused to call it the Yemeni War. They referred to it as the Southern War. After the North's victory, there was this media campaign blaming the South, portraying them negatively. Southern leaders were imprisoned or neutralized. Southerners essentially became terrorists by definition in the official narrative, and the Southern issue was diminished, at least publicly. This defeat and marginalization created deep, lasting resentment in the South.
Which takes us towards the more recent cycle of civil wars and conflicts, culminating in the absolutely devastating crisis we see today. What was the trigger for this latest wave of conflict?
It really kicked off with the 2011 uprising, part of the wider Arab Spring movement that swept the region.
Right.
You had peaceful protests demanding President Saleh, who had been ruling for over 3 decades by then, step down. People were fed up with corruption, poverty, unemployment.
And Saleh did eventually leave power, but that didn't bring stability, did it?
No, not at all. There was a deal brokered by the Gulf Cooperation Council, the GCC. Saleh handed power over to his vice president, Abdrabbu Mansour Hadi. But almost immediately, Saleh started working behind the scenes to undermine Hadi's transitional government.
So more instability.
Exactly. Political maneuvering, ongoing corruption, government dysfunction. It all just fueled increasing unrest across the country.
And this unrest, this power vacuum, it provided an opening for another group to rise dramatically.
Yes, the Houthis, also known as Ansarullah. They're an armed group from the north, rooted in the Zaidi Shia minority. They had a long history of fighting Saleh's government in the 2000s.
Right, several wars.
7 wars, yeah. And they grew significantly in size and capability after the 2011 uprising, really capitalizing on the chaos and public discontent with the transition.
And their rise was incredibly fast.
Astonishingly fast. Following more unrest after the 2012 election that confirmed Hadi, they began seizing territory. Then in September 2014, they conducted this lightning takeover of the capital, Sana'a.
How did neighboring Saudi Arabia react to this Houthi takeover?
With extreme alarm, utter alarm. From the Saudi perspective, a Houthi-controlled Yemen, which they saw and still see as being closely aligned with their regional rival, Iran,
Okay.
well, that represented an existential threat. They feared Iran essentially encircling Saudi Arabia via allies in Iraq to the north and now Yemen to the south.
And that fear led directly to the Saudi-led military intervention.
Precisely. In March 2015, Saudi Arabia formed a coalition of several other countries. Their stated goal was to counter the Houthis, who they described as obedient to Iran, and to restore President Hadi's government to power. They launched a massive air campaign.
And what's been the result of that intervention now years later?
The sources paint a grim picture. Years of just brutal warfare. The air campaign has caused incredibly high civilian casualties and contributed massively to a devastating humanitarian crisis, often called the world's worst.
Did the intervention achieve its goals?
Militarily, it led to a stalemate. There were brief coalition victories, but overall it turned into this brutal war of attrition. Neither side has been able to achieve a decisive victory. It just ground on, causing immense suffering. The sources even note how remnants loyal to Sa briefly switched sides again in 2017, fought the Houthis, and Saleh himself was killed in the process.
And the sources also emphasize the ongoing fragmentation, the complex power dynamics within Yemen today. It's not just two sides, is it?
Not at all. It's incredibly complex. You have this unique power vacuum. The internationally recognized government, now based mainly in Aden, struggles to assert control. The Houthi movement controls the capital, Sana'a, and much of the northwest.
And the south.
The south is particularly complex. You have that sensitive southern issue lingering from the 1994 war, with various actors like the Southern Transitional Council, STC, competing for influence and resources, sometimes pushing for separation again. There are multiple political, military, and security actors vying for power.
And external intervention continues to be a massive factor.
Absolutely. The Saudi-led coalition's intervention and the ongoing blockade add immense complexity. It devastates the economy, prevents aid getting through effectively, and fuels resentment. Plus, various international and regional powers continue to support different factions, which just makes finding any kind of political settlement incredibly difficult.
The sources really paint a picture of a complex social and political structure, made even worse by the geography and the long history of underdevelopment.
Yeah, it's described as more chaotic than many other conflicts, a hellish theater, because of the sheer scale of human suffering. The state is often just incapable of enforcing law and order across this fragmented landscape. You've got rugged terrain, resource scarcity, and these deep-seated tribal and sectarian divisions constantly being manipulated. Local actors often operate completely independently of any central authority. Petty regimes. Petty wars, as one source puts it.
Okay, let's shift focus slightly because amidst all this conflict, Yemen has this incredibly rich cultural heritage. What are some of the key aspects the sources highlight?
Oh, it's immense. The cultural identity is incredibly diverse. You see it in the architecture, literature, music, handicrafts, oral traditions, beliefs, everything. Sources talk about shining contributions in thought, philosophy, even early science like math and astronomy.
The architecture sounds particularly unique. You mentioned the tower houses earlier.
Yes, and it's described as really unparalleled. You have everything from ancient stone monuments like the ruins of the Marib Dam or the old city of Sada to those distinctive mud brick buildings you see in places like Shibam, the Manhattan of the desert, and Old Sana'a. Both are UNESCO sites.
And this architectural diversity reflects the country itself.
Exactly. It comes from the different ethnocultural groups, the very geography. You have mountainous highlands, sandy deserts, coastal plains, and the tradition is ancient, tracing back 5,000 years to temples and palaces built with immense stone blocks. You see the whole spectrum: nomadic tents, semi-nomadic stone towers, those multi-story tower houses in settled areas, even coral stone houses on the coast.
What about literature? Is there a strong tradition there?
An exquisite heritage, the sources say. It was modernized with the adoption of Arabic script way back in the 4th century. Yemen is actually home to some of the earliest known written Arabic inscriptions. Yeah. And there's a long line of historical texts, pre-Islamic poets, later poets, epic poems, even secular literature like diaries and administrative letters. Poetry calling for resistance against foreign enemies is also a recurring theme.
And the arts and music.
Again, traced right back to the dawn of civilization there. Diverse customs, incredible creativity in things like painted claywares, stone carting labas stone is mentioned. Metal art described as marvelous and ingenious.
Any recent discoveries mentioned?
Yes, quite recently, these artistic lamentation plates made of lead, dating back to maybe 1900 BC, they apparently show a sophisticated pre-Islamic visual language. And music, it evolved from early reliance on just the human voice to using various traditional instruments with unique rhythms and folk singing traditions.
So to understand modern Yemen, we also need to look at its economic history. The sources note this is complicated by a lack of data, but it's clearly interwoven with Yemen's position in the world.
Exactly. Yemen's economic life, even historically, has always been connected to wider global systems through its traders, its farmers, its builders.
Yeah.
Its geography, particularly its remoteness from Luobatamia, meant sea trade along the Red Sea and Gulf of Aden coasts became really important early on, complementing those overland caravan routes like the incense route.
And we saw earlier how trade was tightly linked to politics in the ancient states like Saba and Himyar.
Absolutely. Controlling those trade routes, the agricultural plains, the mineral resources, there was a constant source of power and conflict between the different kingdoms and tribes vying for dominance.
Fast forward quite a bit. Oil and gas were discovered much more recently. What impact has that had on the economy?
Well, oil and gas were first discovered and produced in 1984. There are potentially vast mineral resources with estimated reserve of over 1 billion barrels of crude oil and significant natural gas, mostly offshore.
So a potential source of wealth.
Potential, yes. But production has actually been quite slow and plagued by challenges. Even in the late 80s, extraction was low despite high prices. Fears stemming from tribal gangs, civil strife, bombings, these have all affected production over the years. And there wasn't really a strong national oil company initially.
And the sources suggest that, like many other things in Yemen, the early oil industry got tangled up with corruption and political infighting.
Yes, there are definitely allegations mentioned. Things like development contracts going to top businessmen who indirectly bought up interest, allegations of Islamist gangs trying to destabilize things, presidents protecting certain groups, tribal chiefs affecting oil rights. It highlights how this potential economic boon quickly became another element entangled in the country's conflicts and power struggles.
Moving back to the more recent political developments, your sources detail that really volatile period after Saleh finally stepped down in 2012. There was some initial hope pinned on President Hadi, wasn't there?
There was. Many Yemenis genuinely hoped Hadi could turn things around, improve security, fix the economy. But that optimism just vanished incredibly quickly.
Why? What happened?
Terrorist organizations like al-Qaeda gained more ground, committing massacres, kidnappings, armed confrontations actually increased, and crucially, key military units like the 363rd Brigade mentioned in the sources remained loyal to Saleh and refused to follow Hadi's orders.
So Saleh wasn't really gone from the picture even after leaving office?
Not at all. His loyalists actively worked to undermine Hadi. They disliked Hadi's attempts to assert authority, especially over the military. Hadi found himself trying to balance all these conflicting powers and factions, and in doing so, he rapidly lost popularity and credibility. He made appointments, like Mohammed Bassinwa as prime minister, trying to appease different groups, but the underlying power struggles continued.
The sources seem to suggest that the fundamental challenge Hadi faced was really rooted in Saleh's long legacy.
Absolutely. Saleh had ruled for decades by building and maintaining this powerful but ultimately very fragile coalition. He was based on balancing tribal leaders, military figures, different regional factions, mostly from the north. It kept him in power, but it was an authoritarian system managing a crumbling economy, especially after unification.
And Hadi inherited this broken system.
He inherited this weak, deeply divisive structure. And as we discussed earlier, both he and Saleh failed to create a new, unifying national narrative.
Leaving all those underlying fault lines exposed and ready to be exploited again.
Precisely. Those divisions, religious, regional, class, tribal, they'd been exploited historically by foreign powers like the British in the South, and post-unification, they were ruthlessly leveraged by Saleh himself and other contenders vying for power. Unification didn't heal them. In some ways, it made managing them even harder.
And Yemen's strategic location, right there on major oil transport routes, always keeps it in the spotlight for external powers.
It's a constant theme throughout its history, isn't it? That location near the Bab el-Mandab Strait. Successive empires, regional powers, they've always been interested. either for Yemen itself or as part of broader geopolitical games. Romans, Ottomans, the British entry into Aden fundamentally changed the south, while the north remained distinct.
Fast forward to the late 20th and 21st centuries, and this external intervention seems to become even more pronounced, more complex.
Definitely. From the 1950s, you had Saudi Arabia actively opposing Nasser's pan-Arabism, fearing a secular republic in North Yemen would inspire movements within Saudi Arabia itself. That rivalry intensified after the 1962 revolution in the north.
Then Iran enters the picture.
The 1979 Iranian Revolution added a whole new dimension. You see more aggressive pro-Iranian Shia activism, which galvanized opposition to Saudi and Egyptian Sunni regimes. Yemen tried to stay neutral but had historical ties. Saudi Arabia became increasingly fearful of spillover, pressing Gulf states to mediate in Yemen's internal affairs.
Which led to things like the Gulf Initiative after 2011, Saudi-sponsored talks trying to manage the transition.
Exactly. The Gulf Initiative, the national dialogue process. These were attempts, often driven by Gulf fears, to manage the transition away from Saleh. However, the sources are pretty clear that certain moments, like Saleh's brutal crackdown on pro-democracy protesters on unification anniversary, fundamentally blew up those processes and helped spiral the country back into civil war.
The global financial crisis and the Arab Spring then added yet another layer of instability and expectation.
They did. There was some hope, perhaps, that the economic crisis in the Gulf might change their subsidy-driven approach, and the energy from protests in Tunisia and Egypt definitely resonated in Yemen, even if the context was different. Yemen was high on everyone's list of potential dominoes.
But the transition didn't go smoothly.
No. The sources sort of ponder whether Yemenis could manage it better than their neighbors, but conclude that key figures like Hadi and maybe even the Saudis were ultimately wrong-footed by the sheer complexity of Yemen's reality, its deep divisions.
So that post-2011 conflict, often called the Forgotten War, saw Saleh initially clinging to power, escalating violence.
Right. His goal seemed to be outright military victory against the protesters and rivals. When that failed and senior figures started defecting, it led to that negotiated exit deal. But even then, his family and loyal clans retained significant influence within state institutions, particularly law enforcement, making the political transition incredibly fraught from the start.
Okay, finally, let's touch upon the social structure and demographics described in the sources. What fundamentally defines the people of Yemen?
Well, first off, it's a diverse nation, despite being overwhelmingly Arab, over 90%. But there are historical layers from centuries of settlement, including groups migrating from the Hijaz after Islam arrived. Geography is absolutely crucial, defining distinct communities in the coasts, the highlands, the deserts, each with different ways of life.
And we've mentioned the religious divisions several times. How significant are they?
They're very significant. You have Zaydi Shi'ism, predominant in the north and northwest, and Shafi Sunni Islam prevailing in the south and east. These aren't just theological differences, they represent long-standing sectarian identities, sometimes accompanied by rivalries and hostilities. These divisions are fundamental sources of socio-political fracture, often manipulated by political actors.
The sources also mention some ethno-linguistic diversity beyond the main Arab groups. Are there other communities?
Yes, there are smaller groups mentioned. The Yosef, for instance, are described as Arabic speakers of African descent, reflecting historical links across the Red Sea. Their culture is largely Arab now, but remnants of Afrocentric customs sometimes remain. There are also references to small populations of Indian-Pakistani origin, historical Jewish communities, and Persians, though they aren't always considered Yemeni by the Arab majority. Dialects also vary significantly across regions. Sanaani, Tazi, Hadrami, Adeni, Mari, Laji are mentioned.
What about education and literacy? Yemen has ancient learning centers, but what's the modern picture?
It's a mixed picture, really. Yes, Yemen has a long history of educational institutions, some of the earliest seminaries in Arabia. Public schools were established much later, really expanding after 1960. There's a basic, secondary, and higher education system.
But there are challenges.
Significant challenges. Historically, Yemen has had some of the lowest primary school attendance rates and huge inequality, especially for girls. Even in recent years, large numbers of children haven't attained basic schooling.
And the quality.
The sources describe schools often being in poor condition, poorly resourced, lacking trained teachers. Bribery affecting enrollment is mentioned. Education is described as being disqualified, contributing to broad illiteracy. There's also a parallel religious madrasa system, often separate from regular schools and primarily for boys.
And finally, what did the sources say about the role and situation of women in Yemen?
Well, the sources frame it within the context of a traditional Arab Muslim society, mentioning issues like polygamy and bride purchase, though noting some practices exist elsewhere too. They describe significant restrictions and challenges affecting women's economic rights, freedom of movement, legal standing, like their testimony carrying less weight in court.
Is research easy?
No, the sources explicitly state that research on this is severely hampered by lack of data and bureaucratic hurdles. But the available data and common perception, according to the sources, points towards women facing sociopolitical isolation, having their rights often ignored by the state, and facing ongoing legal violations, like female employees going unpaid for months. While education is legally gender inclusive, it needs major qualitative improvement.
Okay, bringing all these threads together. Yemen today is facing this catastrophic situation, but it's clearly rooted in this incredibly long, layered, and often tragic history.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
It's a nation, as we've seen, with immense topographical and cultural diversity, a truly vibrant history. Ancient civilizations, unique architecture, early writing systems, rich traditions. You have UNESCO World Heritage Sites, testament to that.
And yet that entire history is also profoundly marked by these cycles of internal division and fragmentation and relentless external intervention.
Exactly. The historical division into North and South, the troubled unification process that collapsed into civil war, the persistence of those tribal and sectarian fault lines. And then layered on top, its strategic location, constantly attracting the competing interests of regional and global powers. It's made it a continuous arena for conflict and power struggles for centuries.
So the current crisis, this forgotten war, isn't an aberration. It's the latest and perhaps the most devastating chapter in this long history. The obstacles to peace talks seem immense.
They really are. You have the armed Houthi movement controlling the northwest, often refusing negotiations. You have the incredibly sensitive southern issue with competing actors there. You have the breakdown of state authority, the erosion of national identity, and the constant interference of regional powers like Saudi Arabia and Iran and others supporting various factions.
The sources really emphasize the sheer complexity, don't they? A hellish theater of suffering.
Yes, aggravated by geography, underdevelopment, resource scarcity, and the inability of any central state to impose order amidst all these widespread, petty conflicts and competing local actors.
So, reflecting on everything we've discussed, what does this all mean? We've traced Yemen's story from those origins as a rich, ancient trading hub, an engineering powerhouse,
Through eras of shifting foreign rule, Ottoman, British, deep internal divisions.
to the complexities of unification, its failures, and the devastating conflicts that engulf the country today.
Yeah, we've really seen how geography, trade, and these powerful external forces have constantly shaped Yemen's destiny. But alongside that, there's the persistence of its unique culture and the enduring tragic struggles of its people against poverty, against the lack of governance, and against seemingly endless conflict.
The sources definitely paint a picture of a nation with incredibly deep historical roots, remarkable resilience in some ways.
But also one that's constantly grappling with these internal fault lines, these deep divisions, which are just relentlessly exacerbated by outside interference. It's a toxic combination.
It seems this deep dive has really shown that Yemen's current crisis isn't something sudden. It's really just the latest chapter in a very long, very layered history of conflict, of strategic importance, and sadly, of many missed opportunities for stability and progress.
That sums it up well, I think.
So here's a final thought for you, our listener, to mull over. Given this incredibly long history of external intervention, this persistent internal fragmentation, and the undeniable strategic importance of its location, can Yemen ever truly achieve lasting peace and stability without fundamentally changing those dynamics, without addressing both the deep underlying divisions within its own society and somehow mitigating the persistent, often destructive influence of regional and international powers?